Thanks for joining us for the latest episode of the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoTSSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm Brian Sherman, your host and Chief Content Director for Get Channeled. Joining me for today's podcast is Zachary Slade, Risk Management Consultant, Technology and Software for GCG Financial LLC. Based in the Chicago area, GCG is a nationwide specialist in employee benefits, risk management, wealth management, and insurance. Zach, I'd like to welcome you to the Secure Connections podcast.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to a great discussion on a topic I know is top of mind with a lot of people on the channel these days. I can't think of an event I've been to in the last 6 months, especially security, where cyber insurance hasn't come up. So I'm looking forward to digging a little deeper into your expertise and learning more about the topic myself. So to start off, I understand cyber insurance is a continuously evolving market with many options available to MSPs as well as their customers. So what is cyber liability insurance, and what types of plans are available to MSPs and their typically small to mid-sized business clients?
Well, let me first touch on what you said about it being continuously evolving. That couldn't be more of the truth. It's kind of the Wild West out there right now. You have these top insurance companies all competing to provide the best products. So every 6 months, you have Travelers, Chubb, CNA, with all great A-rated companies coming out with their elite product. And as a result of that, every 6 months, really, the terms and conditions are changing. So to answer the second part of the question, what does it cover? Well, it's intended to cover the first-party liabilities. Meaning, if you're hacked, the cost of notification, cost of forensics, those are all first-party exposures. The third-party exposures, which if you're an MSP working on somebody else's system and their system is hacked and you're held liable, that would be a third-party liability. It's the first-party liabilities, the third-party liabilities, and when I say these companies are all competing to provide the best product, what I really mean is that they're all competing to eliminate exclusions. So these insurance companies, what they do to, an underwriter's job is to collect adequate premium for the exposure, and how they limit the exposure is by adding on conditions in which they won't cover the claim. You have first-party liabilities, you have third-party liabilities, and then as the cyber attacks get more and more sophisticated and different type of attacks occur, things like social engineering, are emerging coverages that are being added on to these policies. And so we can get into more detail, but yet it's a very complicated, continuously evolving market where it's really important for the person purchasing the policy to understand exactly what's covered and what's not covered.
Gotcha. So you had mentioned exposures, and I know touched on a couple of things, but can you give me some of the examples, or maybe an example of two, of how the coverage would work for, let's say, a company, fairly decent sized company, maybe a 100-employee company that comes in and they find out that malware has basically ransomware has taken over their computer systems. How would insurance basically help them in that situation?
Well, they would file a claim, and insurance should come in. It would figure out the cost of forensic, bringing in a team to correct the issue, to figure out how this all happened, exactly what was affected in the network, to notify all the customers and pretty much solve the problem. Also cover any type of downtime. So if there was business lost as a result of the network being down, insurance would cover that as well.
Excellent. So they have to have detailed information, I would assume, when they come in to, you mentioned bringing forensics in, but have to have detailed information on what occurred, what losses they would have encountered, all of those type of things, I would guess. Am I on track with that?
Sure. That's a great point you bring up. A lot of the policies will allow the customer to use their own vendor, to use whoever they're working with right now, which especially for the audience listening might be important for them to ask their clients, hey, does your cyber liability insurance policy dictate that you use their their team, or does it allow you to use your own? And that's an important question for especially the MSPs to ask their clients.
Okay, great. So it sounds like there's a lot of factors involved. Obviously, they should understand what's covered, what's not covered. We'll go into a little more in depth on that as we go along. We're just trying to, I think, talk about, what it is and why it's important for MSPs. But you mentioned, there's been a lot of changes and new trends in cybersecurity coverage. What should MSPs be aware of today that's changing and could continue to evolve?
Yeah, certainly the new types of coverages that are being added to these policies, like I mentioned social engineering. And what's so crazy right now is different companies. There's really no consistency. I'm going to back up just a little bit.
Sure.
For a general liability policy, someone can tell me they have general liability insurance, and without even looking at the policy, I could probably respond with a pretty high degree of accuracy in terms of what's covered and what's not covered. If somebody were to tell me they have cyber liability insurance, it would take me 15 minutes to actually read the policy and understand how the policy would respond. So to go back to your question, as different types of cyber attacks occur, the insurance industry takes a little bit of time, but they come up with a response, a policy response. How is the policy going to respond to this type of attack? So you have things like social engineering, cyber crime, you have telecommunications fraud. So all these different types of coverages that are being added to these policies, and you want to make sure that your policy is up to date and you understand exactly what the policy would respond to and what it wouldn't respond to.
Gotcha. It sounds a lot like an SLA for MSPs, making sure that their service level agreements are in place for all these different factors and making sure the fine print is covered. You also mentioned,
I think that's a great analogy.
You mentioned social engineering. Can you go into a little more in depth on what that means for the audience? I know it's not a fairly new term, but it's kind of specific to some of the attacks taking place.
Yeah, good question. So social engineering is if the best example I'm going to use is you get an email from somebody claiming to be somebody else, and it could be the CEO of your company emailing the accounting department saying you need to pay a new vendor $50,000 or something like that, and the accounting person sees the email, and it may be just barely off. We actually had one sent from GCG Financial. It was somebody that it was a social engineering scam on our company. And it was the CEO of our company, Alan Levitt, at gcgfinancial1.com. So they went out and they created a domain with literally one digit difference and emailed the accounting department. And unfortunately, we caught it. But that is a type of social engineering claim. So if the person in accounting actually were to send the money, our social engineering insurance, the portion of our insurance that's under social engineering would respond to that type of situation.
Gotcha. Yeah. So those are basically those trusted known sources where they're leveraging people that they know in their email and other communications to deliver some sort of malware or virus or create a scheme.
Exactly. It's not so much of a breach as it is, them phishing and trying to grab something. And if they bite, then it becomes an insurance claim. But traditionally, it was like the insurance would look at that as not a legitimate claim because there was no true breach that occurred. It was the mistake of somebody. It was human error that allowed it to happen, and therefore it's not covered. Well, because it's so common and these attacks have gotten so sophisticated, now insurance is covering it, and it's so common to where you want to make sure your insurance covers it. And also, you got to look at. I had a case yesterday. It was a social engineering policy that we wrote, and what the underwriter was doing was they put a condition called the out of band condition. So it's an endorsement that covers social engineering essentially, but then the condition was the person who's affected has to actually make a phone call to verify the accuracy in order for the policy to cover. This is just an example of the insurance companies trying to, the underwriters trying to add conditions that prevent the policy from paying, which is crazy. So we understand this, and we went in and requested they omit that condition, and they did, and there was no charge. But that's why it's so important to have an insurance provider that understands this, that knows what to ask for and knows how to custom build the policy. So the company doesn't have an out. They have to cover the claim scenario.
Right. And I imagine, I know that seen some stats where nearly half, or in some cases more than half, of the cyber attacks and the damage in particular is caused by people. We know the human factor is the weakest link in security. So it seems like the social engineering, having a good, strong policy that covers that would be huge for MSPs and their clients.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about common coverage limits. What do you see? So if I'm an MSP and I'm brand new to the cybersecurity insurance world, haven't really dealt with that much, what do they need to know about coverage limits?
Yeah, great question. It varies from industry to industry, from situation to situation. But what we do is we use a company called Advise, and so we pull peer data. We look at other companies who do what you do. What coverages are they carrying? What are the legal trends? Recent breaches? How much was paid out? So I think looking at peer data and having a provider that pulls that peer data is probably the best way to get an indication. But just to kind of give you a ballpark, a range, $1 million is certainly the kind of the industry standard. That's kind of what we see, the normal. However, we always recommend two, especially if there's a lot of third-party liability, if you're working on other people's systems, and there's a chance that you can be held liable for the breach of another company. Definitely $2 million, but it really depends upon how much personally identifiable information you have access to, and from there we can kind of look at what would a maximum claim actually be.
Makes perfect sense. And I know the one area we've seen more recently is where some of the tools that MSPs are using, unbeknownst to them, have not been as secure as they would assume as well. So there's been breaches that have occurred through the tools MSPs use. And if they're working with, a number of clients, I would imagine that exposure would be much higher. So I don't know if that's a trend of maybe even looking to see if those coverages should be increased across the board with MSPs, or on their own, not required by the industry. But that seems like a topic of conversation that we could probably spend an hour going into.
Absolutely. Just something to point out. I'm definitely a fan of having a shorter limit with broader coverage. A lot of times people will purchase cyber liability based on contractual requirements. You may work with a client that might require $10 million in coverage, and they'll do whatever they can to meet that requirement. And in most cases, it's an umbrella sitting on top of a policy that is very narrow. It may not have coverage for cybercrime, for social engineering, it might have limited first-party coverage. So often it's not, oftentimes whenever we do a review and someone has this huge tower, we're more of an advocate of going in and saying, you're better off having a $2 million limit with much broader coverage that protects you from all the different claim scenarios than having this crazy $10 million limit that you're paying for that really would only respond under very strict conditions.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So we talked, a little about the coverages or the coverage limits and what MSPs want to do. Obviously, talking to a professional in cyber insurance is crucial first step. But what about the plans? How are the cyber insurance plans structured if I'm an MSP?
Yeah, the first couple pages are going to be a declaration page that's going to list out the types of coverages being provided under the policy and the limit. And then you have 35 pages, usually 35 to 50 pages of the policy forms. And this is where it gets extremely complicated, and you want to make sure you understand all the limitations. So, we always say you sit down with your provider, get your attorney involved if needed, but you want to understand, what is your insurance response to a cyber attack? The whole joke that people make is, when they sit down with us, they'll at least know what's covered and what's not covered. There won't be any shock. You actually had somebody on your podcast a couple of weeks ago, Justin. He took some shots at my industry, and what bothered me is that he was right on a lot of the counts. People have this crazy cyber liability insurance policy, and it does in some cases provide a false sense of security because when something happens, the policy doesn't actually respond. So, look at, of course, the declaration page, but really work with your broker to understand the forms and figure out, okay, when does this policy respond, and in what situations would it not respond? And if we're willing to take that risk, at least we should know it. And that's what we educate our clients on.
Well, that's a great point, because I think it's complicated. When I look at a lot of the forms, tax forms baffle me. When I look at the fine print, how many times do we just sign things that are pushed in front of us because we think that's best? How much time would you say you spend with clients kind of counseling on this? Is there a standard that you go by, like when you have an MSP or a business that comes in looking at cyber insurance? Is it a 2-hour discussion you have? What kind of goes into that discussion?
It's more than an hour, than an hour that we spend either on the phone going through the applications or in person combined before we start an insurance policy. I would say we spend at least an hour in total time just getting them comfortable with again, what their insurance response to a cyber attack would look like. What are the different circumstances that could occur? What are the different claim scenarios that could occur? And, what do we want to provide coverage for, and what are we choosing not to? And a lot of it has to do with risk transfer. We love getting the client in a room with the attorney and figuring out, okay, what are we going to insure and what we're going to contractually transfer to a third party. So there's a lot of strategy involved, but that process definitely takes more than an hour. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, and I think risk management, especially for those dealing with security, they understand the risk management side. The IT professionals that's a common area, but I don't know insurance. That's typically something that a lot of MSPs and MSSPs have done previously. But it sounds like it's an area where they need to focus more time and push back on their insurance providers to explain the various issues so that we're comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I would say definitely engage your broker. It's unfortunate that so many brokers, it is certainly an untraditional coverage. It's always evolving, and a lot of brokers just haven't taken the time to really educate themselves the way they should. So if they're not engaging you should make sure you engage them. And chances are they have access to other resources they can bring in if they don't understand it to help you understand your situation.
Yeah, and I think the peer community too in the channel, it's a very supportive group, and always encourage, if you're not comfortable with something, talk to other MSPs that have been through the process of working with cyber insurance specialists and get the recommendations as well. I think that's just a best practice that many MSPs are familiar with. So you had mentioned something else too. Some channel professionals obviously are skeptical about cyber insurance companies. Maybe based on their own bad experiences or listening to horror stories from clients and peers at events, as you brought up. Most of the non-payment issues that I've seen seem to be rooted in client miscommunications and process failures, but they're nonetheless getting skeptical of insurance companies. So what things usually keep businesses from getting paid? What should they be focused on if something happens?
Great question. I'm glad you brought it up. In most cases, when coverage is denied, it's usually because the policy written was never intended to provide coverage for that event.
Okay.
So all the more reason to really understand what your cyber liability policy covers, because you have all this competition among different carriers, and you have them using different terms to ensure essentially the same thing. It gets really complicated, and the worst thing that can happen is you're paying for this insurance policy. You have an event that happened, and it turns out you don't have coverage. So there's a couple of different common theories out there as to why that happens. One is because the application wasn't filled out properly.
Okay.
What I'll tell you is that's a lot less common than the application was submitted properly and the policy written was just never intended to cover social engineering or cyber crime or a number of different, I'm listing the most common ones, but there are 5-6 parts of a cyber insurance policy that you can either opt to get coverage for or choose not to. And as long as the person purchasing the policy understands all those coverage parts, you're okay. A breach happens, and our clients, when a breach happens, they immediately know, okay, well, I chose not to get coverage for this, or I'm confident that I have a $5 million limit for it. So really what it comes down to is just the broker, in my opinion, not educating the client on what's covered and what's not covered. But it's a scary situation.
Gotcha. And I know some of the complaints I've heard have to do too with MSPs coming into a situation where they start working with a client who has already bought cyber security insurance, or so thought that they had certain coverages when it turns out that they did not, which in my opinion lends an opportunity to channel providers to kind of look through and do a review and maybe even check in with the insurance companies and help do some consulting on that side to make sure the coverages are in place. But in other areas, it's where they had certain requirements of audits and reviews, certain tools to be in place, and they just were not completed by the end user typically. The MSPs came in and found it out after a breach, and it was a little too late at that point. So it seems like, as you mentioned before, it's a complicated issue, but is there an opportunity for providers to kind of check in with their clients and review and maybe reach out to cyber and security insurance experts like yourself to do those reviews and make sure everything's set up properly?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key things that the MSPs or cybersecurity providers can look for. One is to make sure that the policy their client has allows them to choose their own vendor to work with the person that that they want to work with, which in this case would be us, right? Our partners and our network. So we want to make sure that's in place. But also, I think what you alluded to is there was an exclusion, and this has become less and less common, but it was called the security maintenance exclusion, which essentially said that if you don't maintain your security to some really arbitrary level, and you fail to update your network in a timely fashion, the policy won't pay. And anybody listening, I'm sure they know that that's just really not conducive to how networks actually function. So when I say the marketplace is continuously evolving, that's one of the exclusions that we will never write a policy with that exclusion because we know it's ridiculous, and it's just a way for these insurance companies to avoid paying on a claim. So all the more reason to make sure you have an up-to-date policy that doesn't have these crazy exclusions in it. It's just, to answer your question, there are things like that I'd love to go into more detail on that MSPs can kind of have in their back pocket to go, well, let's see your policy. If it does have a security maintenance exclusion, it shouldn't be there. There are insurance companies that write this policy without the exclusion. So it gets super complicated, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely things you can look for. And I'd love to educate the audience more on what those could be.
Sure. It sounds like a great topic for future discussion too, to dive a little deeper into that. But it's also an opportunity. I think it's a conversation that MSPs like to have, because there's certain standards that they'd like to have in place for cybersecurity protection for their clients. Not necessarily it has to be part of the insurance package, but the things that they want them to implement, maybe they aren't implementing. So it's a discussion that can lead them to more security assessments and build their revenue stream, in addition to making sure that they've got the right coverage in place. So it's one of those things. I think any conversation with a client can be productive when it comes around cybersecurity. It's just making sure that they're properly protected, and when something goes wrong, that they can get a payout from their insurance to cover it. So,
Absolutely.
are there any specific exclusions or endorsements that MSPs should be paying attention to? You mentioned one, obviously the performance, I think was one category. Are there any others?
I mean, there's several. To be honest, that is, that's the main one. I don't want to get too technical in others, but I would just make sure that everybody listening understands pretty much, here are the different claim scenarios, and here are the conditions in which the policy would not pay. I think I mentioned another one, and this is very common on a social engineering policy, is this out of band limitation, which is an exclusion, and it says that unless a phone call is made to verify the fraudulent instructions, the policy won't pay. So that is another exclusion that we'd look for. But I don't want to get too into the weeds, especially given that we're kind of short on time here, because we could probably spend a whole call just on exclusions and what shouldn't be there, and the changes these companies are making to the policies being written.
Got it. So, how knowledgeable do you think businesses are? I'm talking, in this case, end user businesses, about what's being covered and not covered under their policies. Do you think there's good understanding with most companies that have gone into this, say, over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's really rare, unfortunately. We will rarely do a review of a cyber policy and respond back and say this is structured appropriately. Either it's outdated, or the client just doesn't understand what's covered and what's not covered. So it's unfortunate, and the onus is, I think, on us, on the brokers, to be reaching out to our clients and educating. We feel like we are, but so many are not, and that's why, like I said, I mean, it's rare for us to do a review and give the thumbs up and say what you have is in good shape.
So it's probably a good best practice for MSPs taking on new clients is to make sure that they go through that process and review their standards, it sounds like.
Absolutely. I would say, go to your clients and say, do you understand your cyber liability policy? I know you have it. The question is, do you have cyber liability? And they come back and they say, yes, we have it. It's built into our BOP. And let me make a disclaimer. Whenever a cyber liability insurance policy is built into a business owner's policy, a general liability package policy, 99 out of 10 times, it's not good coverage. You want to have a standalone cyber policy. It can be combined with your errors and omissions. That's an appropriate structure. To go back to answer your question, definitely ask your clients, okay, we know you have cyber. Do you understand it? Have you had a conversation with your broker about what types of claim scenarios are covered and what types are not? And if they say no, then just have them, recommend they reach out to their broker or sit down with them and their broker and kind of go through everything, because generally the MSPs are going to have a lot more knowledge about the network and all that. So that'd be a good thing to do.
Makes perfect sense. How often do you recommend reviewing these policies with all the changes that take place in cyber crime and the policies, I'm sure?
Once a year at minimum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So to shift gears one time here, how can MSPs ensure their clients are working with a trusted cybersecurity carrier? That's another question that came up. Is I'm sure it's not one size fits all. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can check the rating. There's a pretty, you can just, by honestly using Google, you can kind of determine, okay, is this carrier, generally speaking, good at writing this type of coverage? So that's one part, is choosing the appropriate carrier, and you want to make sure you're with an A-rated carrier and all that. But the second part is making sure you have the best coverage being offered by that carrier, and that really is the broker's responsibility. I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but I know an underwriter at a large company. If I said the name, I'm sure everybody here would know who they are. But his whole joke is they'll always give the broker, in most cases, what they ask for in terms of removing endorsements and exclusions and things like that. But the caveat is they have to ask. They have to know to ask. So, me asking for them to remove the out of band exclusion on the social engineering endorsement is an example of that. So you want to make sure you're with a top tier A-rated company like a Chubb, a Travelers, a CNA, but you also want to make sure you're working with a broker that lets you get the best possible terms from that company. And that's what's so confusing about the industry right now.
And it sounds like also you need a broker that is collaborative, will sit down and spend the time to explain the various clauses and the conditions that may be more applicable to their particular business too.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we know all about the value add when it comes to the channel, and that's so searching for the right company, going back to looking for testimonials and peer recommendations, I think can be crucial, especially in the channel. So social media, if you check out some of the sites, I know some of the IT service provider groups have talked about this and made recommendations, and seeing some good success done that way too. So leverage a network. So I know obviously we're getting a little low on time, Zach, but do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the podcast community?
Yeah, I would just say, make sure you understand, your insurance policy, you're paying for it. So it's good to know that it's going to be there for you when you have an issue. Work with your MSP and involve them as much as possible in terms of the whole process.
Great. Yeah, and I'd love to have you come back in. We can talk about some of those exclusions and particulars too in the future. So I appreciate your time today. So on behalf of IoTSSA, I'd like to thank Zach Slade from GCG Financial for joining us, as well as for those of you taking time out of your busy day to listen in. I encourage you to take a couple more minutes and check out all the great cybersecurity content on the association's website. That's IoTSSA.com. And thanks again. May you all have a very safe and secure day.